Thank you, Diamond. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today. This is one of my absolute favorite topics, data in general, but especially, as Diamond said, thinking about how we can use the information we have at our fingertips to advance equity and systemic impact. So I'm excited to be here today. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. Yeah, here we go. So today, as Diamond said, we're going to talk a little bit more about equity metrics. And so I want to just start off by just a quick conversation. I know that Diamond also shared a question, so don't need to pause here for too long, but just sort of it helps me kind of get a grounding for everyone in the room and what your background and experience is with this. When I go through this conversation, there's a lot of information. There'll be times when I'll be pausing and asking you to share your experiences, feedback, how you've done this. And I was fortunate to be able to look at your assessments that you provided and talk to the team. So I know there's a lot of experience and expertise in the room. I know that many of you have been doing this on the ground. So please don't be shy, speak up, ask your questions, or say, oh, actually, I would do this or add this. So I want to make sure it's a really fruitful conversation and that it leverages the room's experience. But so for today, just a few objectives for what I hope we're able to cover. So first, want to explore steps that you and your organization can consider in developing meaningful equity metrics. We want to talk about how to support the quality use of new and expanded metrics as well. So just as John was saying, it's not just collecting the data right, it's what can your institution then do with that data. And then hoping that everyone here can walk away with some resources, peer suggestions, and ideas for how to embed equity metrics into your work to deepen impact going forward. Move us forward. So before we dive into sort of the meat of today's conversation, just wanted to pause to talk about the status of equity metrics in the United States right now, at least as it relates to requirements. Starting by, of course, knowing that every institution is very different and will do things differently, but just looking at from the top level down what's expected. And so we know that the collection and reporting of race and ethnicity and gender is required for all institutions who receive financial aid. It's also required for vocational programs. And while this data is very impactful and helpful, it is limited in which outcomes are reported that are critical for equity. For example, it's to some of the basic completion information, and it's not disaggregated by other critical outcome information, such as are these credit programs, non-credit programs, et cetera. And then there's some limitations there in which populations are represented as well. So while race, ethnicity, and gender are very important, they're certainly not the only characteristics that reflect equity. And so reason to consider what else we might want to think about or expand to beyond just what's required of us. Some other initiatives that are in place is that to fill in some of the gaps that have been left behind by IPEDS, there are other entities that provide information or have been trying to expand upon information. These include the Scholarship Scorecard, the National Student Clearinghouse, and then the Voluntary Framework of Agreement. This was in prepping for this conversation. It was the first time I'd heard of this voluntary framework of agreement. It seems very interesting and something that some of the institutions here might want to look more into, but it seems to be a paid service and one that if you purchase it, you're able to submit data and benchmark yourselves among others. And they have some pretty expansive outcomes that can be really impactful, it seems. But full disclosure, I have not spoken with someone who's used that. Not sure if anyone here on the line has seen that or used that either, but it might be something interesting to consider going forward. Another thing, just speaking writ large, again, not institution to institution, is that there are states who also provide outcomes-based funding based on equity. There was a good report done about outcomes-based funding tied to equity. And from that, we're able to see what sort of the status is in the United States. From that data, there were really only 26 schools who collected or who required outcomes-based funding based on students who came from low-income backgrounds, and only 19 that had it tied to students of color. And there was even less data around enrollment metrics. So there were only 10 institutions or 10 states that required that had outcomes-based funding metrics tied to low-income backgrounds, and then only 6 tied to students of color. And then only 4 institutions in the entire country that had metrics tied to campus climate, tied to racial equity. So again, just a little bit more about sort of the status writ large of where the United States is. With all of that at a very high level, we can see how there's a great impetus, right, and need to be considering moving towards equity-focused metrics, or thinking about how to expand what we collect to account for the things that the federal government or other systems are not requiring, and how we can move the needle ourselves if we think about how we might want to reflect on the communities we serve, and maybe do things a little bit differently. And so this is really getting at how we want to move from just thinking about the requirements and reporting data based on requirements, but moving towards doing something more meaningful. And for institutions that develop metrics and come up with a process for developing metrics that is grounded in their mission, vision, values, the impact they want to have on their community and their students, they will see a much greater return on investment in what they design and what they experience if they kind of look more inwardly rather than out to the requirements, to think about what is it we want to know and what is it that we want to communicate about our impact here and our purpose here. Just some high level benefits of that can be gained for institutions that look to developing more equity focused metrics. It can help you communicate your value, especially learners, shoppers today are more and more focused on sort of the institutions they support and go to, and more are invested in making sure that the place they land represents who they are and what they want. And so it's really important to be able to say, this is what we value, this is what we talk about. It's really critical for transparency and accountability, of course. It's very important to understand how institutions are serving all their constituents. It's incredibly impactful for informed decision-making for learners. Specific data can help prospective students and their families make informed choices about where they want to attend and how institutions serve and succeed other learners like them. Metrics are also really important tools to help institutions and systems communicate and rally around shared goals. So we can make sure that if we have these shared goals, shared understanding, that we're all working collectively to achieve those goals. And certainly community colleges play a really critical role, and not just in the education system, but the workforce system in their states and their regions. And so it's important to think about how they can work together to move the needle for the residents in a state or a community. And understanding these goals too can be really helpful in understanding who key partners are and expanding those partnerships too. And then, of course, anytime we have metrics, they're really important in helping us foster improvement and innovation. Once we see sort of what does the data say, what do the metrics say, we can see where we need to focus our resources going forward to drive more impact and have a larger impact. And then lastly, I know as everyone knows here, post-secondary credential attainment is very critical to labor force participation. It's very critical to ensuring Americans have access to sustainable, high-quality careers. And so it's really imperative that we understand who in the United States has access to and is included to the benefits that come from a post-secondary credential. So how can we do this? How can we develop meaningful metrics to eliminate inequities and make education work for all? And so here's a list of steps to consider. Definitely would love to hear from others who've been doing this work about what has helped them. But at a high level, I'll go more into each of these different steps, but at a high level, some of the key action items we can take to sort of starting this process or advancing this work if it's already underway would be to start with applying a culture responsive and racial equity lens to our work. I'll talk about that a little bit more next. Really important, of course, to developing metrics that are focused on equity is we have to understand who are the priority populations in our communities that we want to serve. So we even know who to collect metrics about. We want to incorporate expansive and diverse feedback. And this is not just during one phase of our metrics development, but basically throughout the whole process, which we'll talk about a little bit more. We want to take all this information and then develop metrics to reflect the data, feedback, and feasibility that exists at my institution. And then lastly, but most importantly, we want to continuously use the metrics to identify and address gaps as well. All right, so now we'll go into each of them in a little bit more detail. So starting with applying a culturally responsive and racial equity lens to our metrics work. So how do we do this? So there's, as many of you may have heard or used before, there's many frameworks out there for how to apply a racial equity lens to your research or to your evaluation or to your work in general. A lot of information about there about how to apply a culturally responsive lens as well. For this chart, I sort of augmented what a lot of those key practices are to what I thought sort of were the steps for developing metrics. You could probably argue some of these could switch place, but just really tried to help think through what would be how we could include this in the work that we're talking about today, the developing the metrics. And so this is really critical because we want to make sure that anything we do is infused with best practices related to racial equity and inclusion. That's really critical. And when we're collecting, reporting, and discussing data, we want to ensure that we're doing this in an appropriate, respectful, and accessible way. And most importantly, we don't want the work that we're starting, especially if it's newer to us, to cause more harm than impact. We want to make sure that we're starting from a place of understanding about how to use these data in the best way possible to advance impact, not to potentially further carry on stereotypes or use language that's inappropriate. So some of the things to think about when applying this lens to this work is starting from a place of context and awareness. How to do this really is to make sure that any staff or any committee members or any of those involved at your institution who are doing this work are steeped in or have received training in racial equity and culturally responsiveness. We want to make sure not only do they have that training, so again, they can think they can come from a very informed, educated place about how to talk about the populations they serve, but that also they collect critical context for the region they sit in and their students. So it's making sure that this information is really grounded in where someone sits. So the populations, obviously, of our communities vary across the entire United States. And so we want to make sure that we really understand local context. We really understand the regional context. And we're making sure we bring that into this process as a starting spot. And then we also really want to incorporate feedback that's just in one place on this chart, but again, that's going to be throughout this whole process. So we want to make sure that the context that we've collected is then being used to understand, well, who in my community needs to help us in this process? Who do we need to hear from? Who do we need to include, and how, to make sure that there's representative feedback throughout the entire metrics development process, later on the data collection, and then later on the using that data for improvement. Of course, we want to make sure we use best practice when it comes to actually developing the metrics and the data collection behind it. We want to make sure that once we get to a place of understanding, okay, here's what we need to know about this population, that we then, of course, know, well, what is the right language? What are the different identities that sit within that population, or what are the right values? And so we want to make sure we're taking extra steps to, again, not cause harm, but be able to communicate and collect data in a respectful, appropriate way. And that might mean, again, making sure that we have the right feedback. If the identities of those that you're collecting are not represented in those who are help making these decisions, how can you vet that with the community in an appropriate way? So for example, if you're trying to collect more expansive identities tied to gender, making sure that you're using the best possible language so that we're not harming students when we collect this information. And then, of course, that all falls into place with reporting as well. How are we speaking when it comes to, if we're going to develop a dashboard, whatever it is that we're going to use to share this information, making sure it's appropriate terminology and language. And then beyond that too, really speaking directly about the findings and situating them in the appropriate context. So this is critical to any racial equity and inclusion work. But if we're finding that there are inequities, we cannot hide from those inequities. We need to speak them out loud and address them. And we need to speak about them in an educated, comprehensive way. And so really the very last thing you'd want any of this work to do would get to a place where you've now worked to collect this information, and now you're at a place where you have it and you're afraid to communicate it or share it back out. That would, of course, cause way more harm than having started the work to begin with. And then lastly, and most importantly, and continuously, is we want to use the data. We want to make sure that we're using the data that we find to improve programming, recruitment, and that whoever's involved in this process has come up with a process for continually reviewing the findings to ensure consistent feedback. So this is not a one-step phase. It's not I'm just doing this in 2023 and I'm done. This is a continuous phase for all of time, just making sure that we're kind of always staying on top of what our students are experiencing, knowing that things are changing all of the time. So I want to stop there. I've talked a lot and just see for others who've done this work, is there, from these sort of high level steps, we're going to go into the other ones, but when it comes to applying this lens, is there anything that's really that you see here that's missing, or anything else that you would want to make sure that your peers have to consider in doing this work too?
We did have a question here in the chat from Kristen. Kristen, did you want me to?
I see it. Yeah. So which step area do you think is the most tricky to implement, or where do pitfalls typically happen in this framework? So this is I think Kristen, you're speaking about the culture responsive framework versus all of the steps. So I think if that's true, stop me if it's not. I think all of them are a little bit tricky depending on where you sit, who's at your table, who's not at your table. It can really depend. If you're an organization that already uses this language, already has this knowledge, then this will be a lot easier to move forward in this way. But if some of the partners at your table are not used to being as considerate or maybe thoughtful or aware about why we would shift to this, it might be a little bit of a slower process that involves providing education about why we would do it this way. But I think for me, for where I sit, I think that incorporating feedback is always the challenging thing. We'll talk about that in the next step. And in the next section, I definitely want to make sure that I hear from others who've done this. But I think especially in today's age, lots of people are tapped to provide their feedback. Lots of people are burdened. Lots of people are really, really busy. And it can be hard to get everyone at the table that you need at the table at the same time to really participate with the level of participation that would be needed to have an impact. But we'll go into a little bit more in depth, Kristen, some of these. And if you still have questions or it's confusing, please raise your hand or type another question. Any other? Okay, I want to make sure I keep us somewhat moving, but again, please come off mute and add your experiences. So identifying priority populations for your community, arguably, this is a pretty critical step for any metrics development work. So it's really important to step back and say, who should provide feedback and be represented in our metrics? So how are we going to do this? How do we expand this? I want to just stop on this section 2, because this will be different for everybody at this table, unless you sit in the exact same community as another one of your peer organizations here. This will be different. And this is where taking this approach is really critical. And especially when thinking about how to not check the box here, but develop something meaningful. As we are all located in a unique region of the United States with unique demographics, unique contexts, unique history. And we need to make sure that the metrics we develop reflect that and reflect those that we serve. And so a first great step, maybe this is something your institution already does really well, but if not, would be to disaggregate your institutional data that you already have by all available characteristics. Each of us will sit at a different institution, we'll collect different data, even beyond just what's required by the federal government. And so a key first step would be reaching out to whoever you need to at your institution to access that data and try to understand what you can about what is already known about students and their outcomes. And then after looking at that data, ideally this would be a group of people, not just one person. You'd want to really think about, well, what questions do I still have? Who's represented here? Who's not? Is this enough? Is this not enough? Do we need to know intersectional outcomes? I think oftentimes we say race, ethnicity, and gender, but understanding gender and race and ethnicity can be extremely pivotal. So for example, is it enough to know about all of the Black learners in my school, or should I try to understand more about Black women specifically, Black men specifically? And so those are really important questions to have. Once you move beyond this step, you'll want to collect demographic data for the entire region that you serve. And then you'll want to know, how does my region compare to my institutional data? And where are there gaps? Where are there inequities? Where do we not have representation from key populations? Or not just, I put regions here, but not, I put demographics here, but not just that, zip codes. Are there whole areas of the community I serve that my organization is not accessible to? And then, for example, if you sit close to reservation, yet your student population does not include Indigenous learners, stepping back and saying, why? Is there a clear reason for this? Is there a not clear reason? Is there more for us to uncover here? And then moving beyond the quantitative data, but getting to more of that qualitative data, we want to talk to our colleagues, stakeholders, others at our institution to try to understand which community needs are unmet. Of course, students too. Try to understand who's underserved, why. What does completion anecdotally look like for parents? Is Pell eligibility comprehensive enough to understand our low-income students, or do we need a different measure that speaks more to what our institution cares about or what's relevant? And so what more do we need to know and about whom to increase success and accessibility? So I'm going to go a little faster here. Oh, am I missing? Oh, are there toolkits that you can recommend to facilitate working through these steps? Yes, I have some. I don't have an exact toolkit for this, but I do have a lot of resources at the end of this. And if they're not direct enough, then of course I'm happy to follow up too. Okay, I've got my warning, so I'm going to go faster. Sorry about that. So I'm going to send this out, and you'll see a chart for a project where we looked specifically at race and ethnicity by gender, and it was really impactful for the project to try to understand, oh, there were some curiosities there. And then moving us a little bit faster too, some possible relevant demographics to consider. Again, this is something that you'll really want to make sure reflects your region and what's been important, where you've run into trouble, retaining students, enrolling students. All of these things should be leveraged in this conversation. But some examples that were found in literature were around citizenship, parental status, and then this one really good report that I linked to talked about first generation status, income quintile versus Pell status, enrollment intensity, and then age range too. So I'm going to move a little faster. So incorporate expansive and diverse voices. So as I mentioned before, this is a consistent process. So we want to know, when and who do we incorporate feedback from? Well, everybody and the whole stage. I know that's not easy to say, and that it is a time resource heavy process. So I don't want to pretend that any of this is easy to do and you can just walk out of here and do this. I know that it's complicated, but to the extent possible, it's really important to incorporate feedback from representative voices. It will ensure that your work is culturally responsive. It will ensure that your work has buy-in. It will help make sure that what you're developing is grounded in what's even feasible from the organization institution standpoint. It will make sure that you more accurately arrive at the root of any issues you're seeing. And it will read a lot more authentic and meaningful. It will be more clear to those that you serve that this was not a check the box. And just one note is that at the very start of any of this work, it will be very clear to decide and communicate who has final say. So if you are collecting all of this feedback from many different people, you want to make sure that you don't just collect it from them and they never hear from you again. You really want to make sure too that you don't raise more questions than answer them. You want to be clear, like, this is, in this case, we want to hear what you say. Final decision is made by X committee, by this person, X, Y, and Z. These will be critical things that you'll need to be able to talk about to have a respectful process that people will believe in. So just some of the ideas about where you want to include feedback: collecting context, like I said, not just looking at the secondary data about the region or your institution, but hearing from others who live and work there about what they're seeing. validating that secondary information, saying we're seeing this, why are we seeing this? What more do we need to know? Of course, when we get to finalizing the metrics and data, making sure they're respectful, use appropriate language, and will answer key questions that your community, the system you work in, might have. And then interpreting the findings and developing solutions. So this is really important. If you were going to go through a thoughtful, respectful process to collect data, then it would be best to, of course, have a thoughtful, respective process for developing solutions to what's identified in that data. And the best way to develop solutions that will have impact is to involve the community in that decision making. And so just as a very quick, just as a quick note, it's of course important to hear from learners, but also potential learners, the state, your local workforce system, employers who you serve, and other critical partners or other critical nonprofits that might sit in your community and reflect the learners. And then most importantly, your institution researchers and decision makers. I think sometimes when we think about this, we say, okay, let's be as representative as we can. But at the end of the day, many of us work in places where we aren't the ultimate decider about what data can be collected. This is a difficult thing. Making changes is difficult. And we want to make sure that we're involving those who have the key to the data throughout the whole process so that we don't run into, so that we're being thoughtful, inclusive, and that we don't run into situations later that we can't address because they didn't have the right information. How do we incorporate this feedback? So some possible things to include is developing an advisory or board or committee. This is how I've done it in other similar projects in the past, which was, we can't include everyone in every juncture, but let's make sure we have the right voices. And then in those cases, we've used surveys to speak to everyone at critical times to make sure we have their feedback. Focus groups can be really important, especially for learners. If you're going to include learners, just be very thoughtful about making sure that you're asking questions that are at the right level, and that they understand. Certainly, they might not be versed in institutional metrics, right? So you want to make sure you're asking questions where they can contribute in a meaningful way. And then context conversations and interviews. I do know that, and then developing the metrics to reflect data, feedback, and feasibility. So, oops, I guess I left the title red here, but so moving beyond demographics, this is really important. I think, you know, in the first section, when we're talking about priority populations, it was really thinking about like, who do I need to disaggregate my outcomes for? Who do I need to know persistence for? Who do I need to know completion for? Who do I need to know enrollment for? But it's not just knowing the for that's really impactful to equity. Sometimes the outcome measures themselves do not paint a full picture of institutional equity. And so we might need to think more broadly about what disaggregated data we need. And so I know a lot of the conversation that I've been part of or that I've seen is needing to understand what is the climate on campus for racial equity? What is this disaggregated data say for credit versus non-credit programs? Other specific programs, John mentioned the construction program. So it's very important not to just know what does completion look like for the school overall, but to get at the root causes and to be able to come up with meaningful solutions, we need to have data that really speaks to specific areas of our institution and programs. And then most importantly, while we are helping, if we know information about students of color or other diverse populations, we're not really moving the needle if we're not trying to understand, well, what does placement look like for students of color? What does job quality look like? What does accessibility look like? Are we placing them in jobs that are going to lead to quality, sustaining careers, and really trying to move the needle and have a much more systemic impact? So this will be in the slides that we'll send out, but just some key things to think about with job quality. Of course, it has to do with wages and benefits, but it also has to do a lot with inclusive and equitable cultures, turnover, worker voice, and then advancement. And so just wanting to make sure that we're giving our students that we say have been not included in the way they should have been or served in the way they should have been, the same access and opportunities that we give all of our students. And then this is just one example of how to do this. This is for a different project in Wayne County, Michigan, but a really insightful tool has been just trying to show different wage brackets and where those, for the region we sit in, how those are earning wages or not. So we can have quality conversations about where placement and advancement should go. And then accessibility too. And so when I talk about occupational accessibility, I mean a couple of different things. Sometimes population-specific barriers, such as those who have been justice involved, but also occupational segregation. We have many programs that exist that are dominated by men. We have many programs that exist where the higher paying supervisorial positions are dominated by white workers. And so we really need to understand, again, for our placement and the work we're doing overall, are we putting our students in situations where they can advance and have a successful career? So putting it all together. So once you get to the point of having all the information you need, you then have to do the really difficult work of going through a process that involves trying to understand what data is even available. Where does my institution say we can adjust things or not adjust things? What will I do if we can't adjust things? Is there supplemental data that we can collect in an appropriate way, or is that going to be way too costly? We'll have to think, of course, about data security and governance and other factors. So I just want to pause and say, while this is really important work, it's not easy work. It's really slow work that requires involvement of many, many, many different partners, decision makers, and trying to think about how can we do this in the best way. And so one of the key things in doing this is starting slow and then scaling. It might mean you won't know everything that you need to know right away, but starting with just one or two things can help rally around, get buy-in, help people show that it can be done, and come up with a better process for how you want to do it in the future. You want to invite researchers and decision makers to the table early on, as I mentioned. And then you can speak to your peers to try to understand how they've navigated roadblocks. So this is something that, while critical, it's just a complicated, layered thing that I don't want to pretend I'm not aware of. And so, but how can we, instead of getting to a defeatist attitude, come up with sort of a problem or solution-oriented aspect to this? How can we get in front of things that have been too hard to do and before, to actually moving towards, well, maybe I can take incremental steps to making changes.